many more areas of the brain become engaged when you are in the act of reading. And it is that engagement that actually does tone up the muscles in your brain, which help you to imagine things.
And in this segment, Reading and the Future of Imagination, we'll delve deeper into deep reading, focusing especially on how it ignites and expands our imaginations. Our speaker for this segment is award winning science writer, lecturer, and broadcaster who specializes in the topic of human brains. Please give a very warm welcome to our speaker for this session, Rita Carter. Rita, please.
Thank you very much, Stacey. It's lovely to be here. I wish I was there, actually. I'm in England in a very rainy country at the moment, so I'd rather be in Singapore. Now, as Stacey said, what I really plan to tell you about today is about the way that reading, particularly reading fiction, can fire a person's imagination, whatever age you are. And sometimes it can start a fire that will go off the rest of your life. The trouble is that it does often not get started for various reasons, distractions being one of them, and not necessarily just the distractions of technology. There are others as well, which I want to mention. And sometimes also it can die out very easily. We can lose that habit. Now, as Stacey said, I'm a science writer. Um, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain. Now, I know you've had some, from Marianne Wolf already quite a lot about the brain and reading, so I won't labor that. But what puts me in a position where I can talk about it is not my expertise in the brain, but because I myself have benefited so enormously from the imagination, the imaginative power that you are given by reading. Um, when I was at school, I was pretty much a daydreamer, and science bored me to tears. I thought it was terribly boring, and I had no intention at all of becoming a science writer as I have. But what happened was that I came across a book, a novel, this, this very tatty now, 60-year-old or more book, which is a thriller, basically. It's not a science textbook. I had no time for those. This was a thriller. And it was a very, very good one. It's very exciting and it's full of people who excited me enormously when I was 12. There was a very cool young male scientist that I fell in love with, and there was a very beautiful woman who was actually an alien. It is science fiction, and I wanted to be like her. So it was really very personal, very emotional, very exciting. But the thing about that book was that it happened also to be about some very interesting areas of science. It was actually written by a very famous astrophysicist who also had a skill, obviously, for writing. And it included things that at that time, remember, I'm going back a long time now, were really cutting edge scientific things. The idea of genetic engineering, of being able to pick up signals from outer space, um, all sorts of things really way out. But it was the first time that I realized that science could be exciting. And it turned me on to science in such a big way that I wanted to know more and more and more. My curiosity was just lit it up, lit it up. That's not a word, you know what I mean. And from there, I went on and I read everything I could get my hands on. And it was that eventually that drew me into science. I realized it was very, very exciting. And more than that, that science led into everything else. That through books, you could trace from just the beginning. Say you start with one area like genetics. If you had access to books, you can go from there into anthropology, into biology, into culture, into ways of behaving, or you could go the other way into physics and biology and science. It took you wherever you wanted to go. So for me, this single book, this fiction, was like a doorway into the whole world, really, which I never stopped exploring or wanted to explore. Now, my thing is brain science, but as I said, I don't want to go into it in any great detail, but I would just like to go into one aspect of it today, which is empathy. Because empathy is, I think, is the first step in imagination. It opens the way to imagination. Could we have the first slide, please? I don't see it. Aha. I think before we go to that, we're going to have a poll. We're going to ask you a question, I think, but I'm not quite sure which one. Can we have there's a little slide of expressions. Okay, let's stick with the poll. I had it there. There we go. Wonderful. The poll I think you're going to be asked about is about cultivating, whether you want to cultivate your work or your children or both. And I hope you'll say both, but anyway, I shouldn't influence you, should I? Because it's a poll. That's not very scientific to actually ask the question and at the same time to give you the answer. So I won't do that. Now, while you're doing that, while you're actually answering that, I wonder, is it possible to have up the slide? Okay, I don't see it. I'll tell you what the slide is going to be here. Slide I wanted to show you here is of people's expressions, just people making lots of different expressions. There we are. Now, if you look at a person making an expression, you just know automatically what they're thinking. You don't have to work it. Most of us, luckily, don't have to work at it. It feels very automatic, very simple, and it doesn't feel as though we're having to exercise our imagination at all. It's just something that we do quite automatically. And it's true that indeed we do it automatically. We are genetically already primed to understand what it means, what a person is feeling themselves when we see them looking in a certain way. And the way that we do it is not by thinking, oh, I think I recognize that. And I remember when I last looked like that I felt like this, and then you feel it. It's not an intellectual exercise at all. It is something that happens quite unconsciously. And if it's possible, could we have the next slide, which is, I'm afraid, a brain? There, yeah. I'm sorry to show you a brain. This is the only slide of a brain you'll have to see in this particular session. But I think this slide is very useful in showing us what empathy really is. It is not just knowing how a person feels and thinking about it. The slide on the left, or the picture of the brain on the left, is taken, it's an image of a brain in a person who is at that moment feeling pain. And you can see, certain areas light up because bits of the brain do different things. And the bits you see lit up there are the bits that light up in a person's brain when they are experiencing pain. Now, the one on the right is a person who is watching the person experiencing this pain. They're not being touched themselves at all. But what you will see there is those same areas which light up in the person who has the pain start to become active in the person who is watching them. It's not the thinking bits. Neither of these brains are demonstrating activity in the thinking bits, the bits that would think, oh, that person's in pain. I'm so sorry for them. I can imagine how they feel. That's not the thing. What the person watching is experiencing is a very, very mild and probably even unconscious sense of pain themselves. Because what empathy is not intellectually thinking what is happening to another person. It is feeling it. It is quite literally experiencing what they are experiencing, walking in their shoes, being in their position, seeing, feeling the world through their eyes. Now, this extends, it's not just pain. I showed you pain because pain is well, there have been most brain scans on it, actually. But it's not just that. Reading, the ability to either watch or even more potently to read of a person experiencing something, gives you the ability to experience the same thing yourself in exactly the same way. You don't have to think about it. It's not that you it's not a thinking process, it's a feeling process. If you are immersed in a book that is talking about a person's experience, you automatically experience that yourself, albeit not to the same, perhaps vivid extent. The degree to which you experience it. If you're reading, for example, a description of a view or a site, the people will vary greatly in the extent to which they have a vivid picture of that. And what makes that experience more vivid depends very largely on how much exercise they've had in doing this particular thing of seeing the world, of transporting themselves into the brain of another person and seeing the world from through their eyes. It's like a muscle. The more that you exercise it, the better you will become at it. Um, one experiment or one study that demonstrated this rather clearly was done by two academics in New York in 2013, David Kidd and Emmanuel Castano, took some people and asked them to read every night for about 20 minutes stories of about people seeing things, doing things, experiencing things. And he also gave another group of people, a control group, some reading to do, same length, quite interesting stuff, but it did not involve that crucial thing of describing what another person was doing, thinking, or feeling, or experiencing. And at the end of, I can't remember how, I can't remember how long it went on, but incidentally, if you want to read more about this and anything else I mention, there will be on the website or at the end of this talk, all the references will be available for you. So you can look it up and read more about it if you want to. Anyway, at the end of this experiment, when the people had finished doing their reading for a few weeks, they were asked again to look at a set of photos of people showing expressions, much like the ones I showed you a little while ago. And they asked the people then to say what these people were experiencing. And the group of people who had been reading about people experiencing emotions were found to be notably better at recognizing the expressions, the feelings that were going on in the heads of the people showing the expressions that they were looking at. In that short period of time, just 20 minutes reading about people experiencing things, they had, if you like, exercised that empathy muscle so much that there was a notable benefit to them in being able to understand what other people were experiencing. The importance of empathy can hardly be exaggerated. You can't get along without anybody who knows somebody who is on the autistic spectrum will know that however clever they might be, the defining thing about people on the spectrum is that they are not automatically good at knowing what other people are experiencing. They can do this, what we've just done ourselves, that is looking at people who are expressing something and know what they're feeling, but they have to go through the mental steps I described. They have to think, oh, I recognize that expression. I know what it means. Ah, yes, they're sad or surprised. And that takes time. And that is why people who are on the autistic spectrum are often a bit slow at getting that sort of personal thing. And as I said, that has nothing to do with intelligence, because they're actually exercising, in a way, more cognitive ability than most of us have to use to arrive at that place. Now, reading, it so happens, is particularly good at that. The reason being that to read involves, it's a participatory activity. It's not simple observing. In order to do that act of empathy, which is so essential to opening up your imagination. You you need to immerse yourself in it in a way that seeing a film, looking at pictures alone, just do not do. You have to do so much work in a way to read, far more, that many more areas of the brain become engaged when you are in the act of reading. And it is that engagement that actually does tone up the muscles in your brain, which help you to imagine things. And that's why reading is so important. Now, I think we've probably come to a point now, haven't we, where we should have another poll? I think another poll question for you. But I don't see it just at the moment. Aha, here we are. Yeah. So I think what you're being asked now is, what sort of books do you read? Do you read fiction, generally, if you have the choice, or non-fiction, or neither, or both? And we'll see the results of those later on. Now, these talks are about reading in the age of distraction. And distraction in this context is usually taken to be things like Twitter and Facebook and gaming and screens and all the fantastic entertainments that are available to people today. And of course, it's true, they are a fantastic distraction. But there's another sort of distraction, which I think often stops people, particularly, well, people of all ages, from carrying on reading or for getting into this wonderful habit of reading fiction. I have another slide. There was a survey done recently of what Singapore children typically read. Do we have a slide of, yes, they were asked, a lot of children were asked, what are their reasons for reading? And as you'll see from there, the top 4 reasons they gave were to learn, to improve language skills, to get better grades because their parents asked them to. In other words, they were all kind of intended to be to functional, to help them do something, tasks they want to do better. And that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But what seems to be missing from there is just doing it for fun. And of course, it's fun reading. It's that emotional engagement, which is the thing that helps imagination. The interesting thing is that when these same children were asked what things they wanted to read, we have the next slide. It turns out that they really like to read exactly those books that will most spark off their imagination, adventures and mystery stories, detective stories, human, and so on and so forth. And one has to ask why there seems to be a bit of a mismatch here. And one does wonder whether perhaps children don't get the chance always to get into books, these sort of books, the ones they want to read and the ones that will really trigger imagination as much as they should, because they feel that they should be doing something which has a direct functionality, and that reading the sort of books they want to read, getting immersed in adventures and so on, is disapproved of or inappropriate, or that they shouldn't be doing it. Now, that, I think, is something that hounds an awful lot of us, and I know it does me personally, that when I pick up the sort of book that would actually transport me into another world, the things I really want to read, I often have a feeling of guilt. I am distracted by the idea that I should be doing something self-improving, or I should be reading a scientific paper, or catching up on the latest in brain imagery or doing something that is more directly and obviously the educational or self-improving. And I just wonder if that might be a habit that starts very early in life, with children being told they should be reading educational books, they feel they should be doing something else with books other than enjoying them, and that perhaps they are distracted by that as much as they are distracted by Twitter and Facebook and so on. And as I say, I certainly feel it myself. And talking to my friends, I know that they often feel very much the same way. And in fact, it was such a conversation that a few years ago made myself and a few friends decide that the way to get over it might be to form a reading group and to tell each other that we've got to read this book. We've got to read a fiction book. We would sort novels in the usual way, but the very fact that there were only 5 of us, that we were each watching the other and making it almost obligatory was a way I found that I could start reading again, because I had lapsed as well. I was getting really bad about reading fiction. But it suddenly opened it up again to me because, hey, I could sit down, start reading this book, and there was no guilt because I had to do this because we were meeting in a few days' time and I had to finish it. Otherwise, I'd be letting the others down. And for the first few meetings, it was like that. I think for quite a few of us. And we often said, oh, it was very strange to be sort of letting ourselves do this, to have this time out almost, it felt like. And then we started to get back in the habit. And all of us reported the same thing. We swapped titles, so that in itself was a great thing because I had started to get stale in my choice of reading matter. I kept reading the same authors again and again because, it seemed such an effort to try to find out what else to read. So I had recommendations from other people, which was great, which took me out of my own comfort zone into wider and wider vicarious experiences. And so my imagination being fired the whole time. And it turned out to be absolutely wonderful. Now, that is my experience, and you might have had the same experience yourself. And there are so many reading groups all over the world now that this is something that's shared by many, many people. But one thing that has only recently crept in is the idea of reading groups that are there specifically to help people with real problems in life and see if reading can be not just a way of making their imagination keep expanding, but also to actually help them through bad times and in some cases as a therapy for really quite serious mental health. And I did a film about this a little while ago. And as part of it, I visited a reading group, which is made up of people who had quite serious depression for a long time. And the group was formed, and it wasn't only a reading group, because people who are depressed find it very difficult to do anything, let alone to pick up a book and start reading it. It's difficult to get the attention. So this group decided to do reading aloud to one another and discussing while they read the book. And if we could have the video up, number 1, I just want to show you how well it worked. Perhaps we could just hear a little bit of this.
Every Linton on the face of the earth might melt into nothing before I could consent to forsake Heathcliff. Stop there and say, is this sort of state she's in something you'd aspire to? Would you like to be feeling what Catherine's feeling for somebody?
Definitely.
I'd love to feel it all the time, and I felt like that. You're like happy nearly all the time. It can last for weeks, months.
It is a beautiful idea in one way when she says, I am Heathcliff. In another way, you get the sense that it could be very, dangerous as well. That sense that
she's married someone under false pretences, really.
I can imagine it then from Linton's point of view. imagine marrying Catherine, but then knowing that she's in love with somebody else. And he will. And he will find out.
I think deep down she should be with Heathcliff, isn't she?
Is he the one where she's sexually attracted
I think
to
so, yes.
and the passion?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's who she should go for.
Now, would you ever believe that those people not very long ago, long before that, were all quite seriously depressed? One of those people I spoke to later, who will tell you his own story in this brief little clip, if I can show you just another clip, because I think this person puts better than I ever could what it did for his imagination. Could we hear this gentleman, please?
I think it's led to depression and very strong suicidal thoughts. And this time last year when I'd had a stroke, I came back to the group. I found that it's books and poems, it's words. It's just fantastic. It sends you into a completely different area.
And I think that's it, really. It's about being transported, as that man said, into a completely different area. And that is why it is so important, one way or another, to find a way to continue to read fiction all through your life, not to feel guilty about it, and not to be distracted, particularly by the idea that really you should be doing something else. Now, I wonder if, I believe there might be some questions for me. Would that be? If anybody would like to ask me any questions, I would be very happy.
Hi, Rita.
Hi,
Thank you for your
Stacey.
enlightening sharing. Yes, we're about to move on to the Q&A segment. But before that, we had an inquiry earlier about the book that you mentioned right at the start of your talk, the one you held up on screen. Yeah, could we just confirm the title and author for the book? Yes.
Yes.
Mm.
I have to say, you will be very lucky to find a copy. This is over 60 years old, which just gives an idea of how old I am. It's called, A for Andromeda.
And let me just do a quick check. The authors are, let's see, the authors are Fred Hoyle and John Elliott.
Exactly. That was very quick. Wow. What database are you using?
Oh, no, I did catch a glimpse of it just now, but I wasn't sure,
I see.
You know, the title of
Absolutely.
it.
Yes, and Fred Hoyle is, he's dead now, but he was a very eminent astrophysicist, and so much of that, I think, he probably managed to work into this book, which is why it was so good.
Wow.
Anyway, I don't know if anyone could get it today, but I think I might have the last copy in the world.
Well, thank you so much for sharing such an important book to you. Okay, we'll jump into the Q&A segment now. So we've had a few questions come in. The first one is, quite an interesting one. What is the role of comic books, graphic novels, in firing the imagination? Rita?
It's interesting. I don't know, and I'm sure there are some interesting studies on that, but I am not aware of them. I mean, I imagine that combination of visuals and the written word would be very powerful, but I don't know, and I'm sure somebody does know, but in fact, I will go and try to find out now, because that is a very interesting question. I do know that films don't have the same effect. It's and this might give us a clue to how graphic novels work. Filmmakers, Hollywood, your standard sort of rom-com Hollywood film, when their brains are scanned, when they're watching it, it does not have as much impact emotionally as a book, a well-written passage of the same thing. It's a much more passive exercise, and one doesn't work as hard. And that is one study I do know about. But of course, graphic novels are not like that. They require much of the same sort of participation as the written word does. In fact, perhaps more. So I'm afraid I can't answer the question. It's very interesting. I will try to find out. But my guess would be that graphic novels could be even more potent in triggering imagination than just a written word. But as I say, I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
So, just by gut instinct alone, you would say that it's a yes, right? To
I think so.
Hmm.
I can only think that it would be because they are so compelling, and it's easy to immerse yourself in it. So I would think so.
I agree. Thank you. Now, our next question would be: is there anything you do to stay focused while you read? Because most of us, we tend to pick up our phone and jump on social media quite quickly, maybe even halfway through while reading.
Yes, well, I personally, because I am easily distracted, I'm not a person who is very good at focusing for long periods. I have a real problem with it. One thing I've done, which is a bit extreme, and I doubt very much if anybody in your audience would dream of doing the same thing, I have not just turned off my mobile phone, I have actually got rid of my mobile phone because I was always, whether it's going or not, even if it's not, if you can't hear a text message or you turn off the alarms or whatever, there is that nagging feeling, so long as you have a mobile phone, I find, of I wonder if anyone's texted me, I wonder if I've missed a call, I wonder if, some news bulletins come up or something. And as I say, even if I found that even if I turned it off totally when I wanted to read, I would still, in the back of my mind, be wondering and have to go and look at it every so often. So I have gone to the absolute extreme of effectively getting rid of my mobile phone. I try not, I mean, you have to keep one nowadays because
Yes,
there are certain things you can't do without one,
yes,
like
yes,
banking and so on.
definitely.
But I mean, apart from that, I don't carry one. I don't have it near me. So that certainly has helped me. I would like to say I do something like meditation. I try. I'm too distracted. I mean, I'm it's more or less do what I say, not what I do here, because I'm not the best. But what I did find, as I said, to keep myself focused on books was that it helped me enormously to have to know that I had friends who were reading them as well. Partly because I wanted to share it with them afterwards. And also, rather banally, I didn't want to get sort of caught out not having understood something, so I would concentrate a bit
Oh,
more.
I
Um,
understand that.
so I find this doing it, making it into a social thing, hugely helpful, and that really did help me to attend. So that's my personal recipe for such that it's worth.
We had a comment in the chat just now from someone who said that the positive peer pressure from a book club helps. So I think
Yeah,
you would agree with that as well, right? Based on what you said.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Um, uh, in your opinion, what genre or type of fiction works best for those who are experiencing depression?
Well, uh, I know it sounds very, very obvious, but actually, things that take you out of yourself and as far away as possible from the things that you tend to ruminate about. Um, there is a very recent piece of work that is absolutely fascinating, which is again, it's a piece of brain imagery work, where a group of scientists. This is fairly speculative. It's very new, but it bears some relationship to this. Um, they have found a way of measuring, finding out from certain signals in the brain when one thought stops and another begins. At one end of the spectrum, there are people who are very distracted the whole time. And when you look at the way that they make this brain scan, the way that they sort of align it, you see that there are dozens of different thoughts, hundreds of thoughts. These people have hundreds of thoughts, but none of them are very deep or lasting. And when you're depressed, most of those thoughts will also be negative thoughts by definition. When you give people a book they have found, or it doesn't actually have to be a book in this case, but a book would probably be the best thing, I think, something around which they have to attend and think, which gives them an alternative content of thoughts so that they are taken away, forced to think about something else, quite simply. You see a different pattern emerges altogether, and these distracted, thoughts that are all over the place, instead start to crowd around they call it an attractor, a strange attractor, because it's very similar to something in physics where things are sort of attracted to it like a magnet. And that is what you see in these brain scans. Now, because this is the only first study, there's a lot to be done, I am sort of speculating here and going a little bit beyond this actual paper, but it occurs to me from that, you can extrapolate from that a book which had content in it which was a long way away from your own particular worries and anxieties. I don't think it has to be a happy book. I don't think that it's important that the content be itself very cheering. I think what it has to be is something that will take you away from your own worries and negative ruminations. So the best sort of book, I think, is the sort that you enjoy and immerse yourself in most, and which is probably on rather unfamiliar territory. But that is speculative, and I don't actually know. Again, I'll probably ask, as I expect somebody's done the work, but I don't know of any work where depressed people have been invited to try different genres and then report back on which works best. But my guess is something that's very exciting, immersing, emotionally engaging, but engaging in something that is not close to home.
Okay. Thank you, Rita. Someone else wants to know if nonfiction helps the brain the way reading fiction does.
I think it helps in a completely different way. People are probably aware that there's intelligence is often divided into fluid and crystallized. Crystallized intelligence being basically what you know, which is very useful for an awful lot of things in life. But fluid intelligence is how you use information. It's a sort of flexibility of the mind where you can draw on things you know, but you don't have to have a vast capacity of learning or memories or knowledge in your head. If you can take in new information and use what you have got, obviously, in the way of crystallized intelligence, but basically if you can process the new information in such a way as to make sense of it. And there's a certain tension between those two. Quite often you find people who study very hard and know an awful lot of facts are a little bit bad on shifting and seeing things from a different point of view, which is what I've been going on about, this idea of transporting yourself, seeing things differently from a different point of view. So yes, it certainly helps you learn things, but I think just to learn things without also encouraging this fluidity of mind, imagination, in other words, is, it's not as good. It's the combination of the two you want, really.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that could work. How about what is your view on poetry then as a way to fire up the imagination compared to reading a full-length fictional book?
I imagine that poetry is probably the best way.
Oh.
But I also have to make a confession. I do not very often read poetry. I'm not a good poetry reader. I think it's because I have spent too much time reading science. And when I read poetry, I think, oh, too fantastical. No, I want to be more precise. Give me a number, put it down. Now, I think that's a deficit in me, I might say. And I also think that I should be reading more poetry. So my answer is that I think poetry is probably, if you get it, I think that poetry is probably the best exercise for the imagination. I suppose there's rubbish poetry, but I mean, I read so little, and I think I'd be such a bad critic. I probably couldn't tell the difference between the two. But I mean, poetry is basically about taking a subject or an idea or a concept and drawing on very wide things. I mean, really drawing in from a very large area, isn't it? Whereas the more scientific you get, until you get down to maths, I suppose, is the ultimate language where you're being terribly precise. And I think most general fiction lies somewhere in between those things, and I'm comfortable in there. But when you get into poetry, for me, it's, as I say, my own deficit. And one day, I keep saying, I will start reading poetry better.
Maybe it's an occupational hazard that
I think it is. I think it can be, actually.
I see. Okay, one more question from I think a concerned parent asking if reading on electronic gadgets is the same as reading paperbacks and whether reading on these gadgets is recommended for children.
Yes, now I did read something very interesting about that just recently. Um, One tends to think that it can't be the same, and in trivial ways, it's not. One of the what they found anyway in this particular investigation was that the comprehension and the extent to which people got immersed in everything else on a tablet was just as good as with the real book, but a lot of people didn't like it as much, and the reasons were rather strange. I was quite surprised by them. It is, for one thing, people aren't as aware of where they are. If it's a story, if it's a narrative story, fiction, the physicality of an old-fashioned book with pages, you have this tactile recognition of where you are in the story because you've actually got the weight in your hands and the pages, you can see where you are. Whereas even readers, though they do put, percentage of the book that you read at the bottom, it's not, doesn't give you that immediate tactile automatic knowledge of whereabouts you are. So you're not as well oriented in the story. But other than that, I am not sure that anyone has found any real disadvantage to screens. I mean, that is leaving aside whether there's any disadvantage about eyes and light and that sort of simple thing. Whether it strains the eyes more, I really don't know. I have taken to reading on a tablet. I very rarely buy a physical, partly because I've run out of book space, like one does living in, particularly people who have limited space, and most of us have nowadays. I buy Kindle books rather than the physical objects, just because I don't want to put them anymore. And I have never noticed. I don't notice a problem. Does this? Oh, I don't know whether it's possible to ask, but has this person noticed a problem? I don't know if it's possible to tell.
I'm not sure if we'll get the answer in the chat right now, but I'll keep an eye on it.
I should think with children, the problem more for the parent is making quite sure that that is what they're doing on their tablet.
I would agree.
Their consideration.
Someone wants to know what you think of adults reading children's books.
Of adults reading to children.
Yes.
Oh, I think one of the things that is very clear is that reading to anybody, to another adult, or like that reading group of reading aloud, that reading aloud to each other is a special kind of thing, because there you are engaging another person. You're not just taking yourself off somewhere. You're going with hand in hand with somebody else. And that itself is such an important and fulfilling thing. And if you're reading to a child, oh, wonderful. I think it's fabulous. And it doesn't just have to be before the child can read for itself. I think if that can be continued, and then you can get the child to read to you, which is even better, because it's a wonderful thing to do, and not something that should be thought of just to do before children are fluent. I think it's wonderful at all ages.
Okay. Now, let's move on to the other end of the spectrum. I have a question here about reading for the elderly. Let me just find it. Okay, someone says he or she works with the elderly and finds it difficult to inspire them to restart reading. What kind of genre of books would you recommend for them? And are there any good fiction books that you would recommend for this age group?
I think that it does sound to me, what I've always suspected is that it's very easy to lose the habit. Even people who are voracious readers, later in life, it becomes more and more difficult to restart. And I think it's wonderful if this person is reading to elderly people. It's a wonderful thing to do. As far as what to read, I think the important thing is more to find out about the individual and tailor it. I know that sounds like a cop out, but it really does have to be, in that case, something that engages that individual. And you, rather the opposite from what to do with, if you are feeling depressed, pick up something that's long, very distant from you. I think possibly in that case, I would suggest finding out what they did when they were younger, or what their interests used to be, or sports, or their job, or something, and try to find a book initially that is about that subject. Because one way to engage them, not even try to engage them so much in the literature, but by prompting memories of what they used to do when they were younger, that itself will bring an engagement. And that if you can start doing that, and also to choose books about things that would be relevant to their youth or young adulthood. All people of all generations have the most intense and vivid memories when they're in late adolescence, late teenage to the middle 20s. It's called a memory hump. And it's the same for everybody. That's when they were really most alive, and they are the memories where everything is most vivid and emotional. And if you can work out what dates that will be in this person's life, and try to find a book that is set in that time, so that you are effectively triggering their own memories, I think that might be the way to start engagement. And thereafter hope to move outwards into broader things, perhaps.
So to try to reignite old memories, old interests that captured them in their youth.
Absolutely. I mean, because simply the act of remembering, so, and this is true for everybody, but particularly for old people, if you can ignite memories of when they were young, the act of memorizing, rather like the act of observing somebody else feeling something, you actually experience it a little bit to yourself. You can't help it. It's automatic. That's what the brain does. In fact, to remember something is to relive it. I mean, your brain is actually doing what it was doing at the time. So that's what you want to get going again. So something that relates to their personal experience when they were younger, when life was very vivid and exciting. I think that is a very good place to start if you can. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for just one more question. It's quite an interesting one. So, are there any potential negative implications that could arise from society's attempt to technologize imagination? So, for example, with augmented reality, with virtual reality.
Oh, so interesting. I'm not an expert. I can't answer as an expert for this. I can give you a bit of just a personal thing, is that I tried quite recently a very sort of say that it's not on the market yet. My nephew runs a company that produces virtual reality. And he put me in a virtual reality thing, which is you can touch, feel, do things in it. It's very advanced. And it's not just like sort of putting on what I forget what they call them, but an ordinary eye set. And the effect on me, anyway, was so profound. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was beyond just stepping into a new world and experiencing. It was like experiencing it in an arc light, rather like that sort of almost artificial sense of reality you get when you look at a lit up theatre. I was surprised, and I can't quite explain it either, but I do know when it came off, when I took all the gear off and was back in the ordinary world, everything seemed very flat and dull. I think so. From my own experience, I think I could say there are negative. A negative thing being, once you've been there, do you want to go back to our ordinary senses, our unaugmented life?
Oh, okay.
And that I can see could be a negative. And I think a lot of people also have, on a much lower level, but a similar sort of thing, when children get so immersed in their computer set games that they don't want to live in the real life and play ordinary games anymore in the garden. We've seen that. And I think it could well be true that if virtual reality and augmented reality got so good and cheap and easy that they were like computer games today, I could imagine the negative effect of people becoming absolutely immersed, not wanting to come out. If you think of that as a negative, I mean, you could spin it the other way and say, hey, what a way to live. And I should say, incidentally, that in case there might be other people listening who, and it might apply to the lady who is thinking of reading to older people, that one of the uses of the things my nephew is doing is for patients who are undergoing chemotherapy or other sorts of rather unpleasant experiences to be put into this other virtual world, and how much it eases the nasty experiences in life. And so while it might be a negative perhaps for younger people who should be out doing something else, it could be a positive for old people who are perhaps physically not capable of doing very exciting things anymore. So I think it could go either way. That's the short answer.
You're right. Thank you for the insight, Rita. And thank you for sharing with us on why reading fiction can truly change us today. Before we end the session, all right, there are 2 questions we would like to ask you. So the first one would be, what are 2 takeaways from your sharing today that you hope participants will bring back home with them?
Okay, number 1, don't be distracted by, a distraction comes in many forms. It can be also the need to go and do your housework or read something very serious. Remember, reading is really good for you, so it's not a waste of time.
Very good advice.
And the second one, do it with other people. Make it social, because if you can get 2 minds in the same world, you will get much more out of it.
Thank you, Rita. All right, and I think everyone would be very interested in knowing this. So, what is one book other than For Andromeda that you keep going back to over the years?
Ooh, that's interesting. I know this sounds well. This might not resonate with you, because I don't know if it's something. It might be very, very English, I fear. But we have now. I don't know, sort of 1940s, I think, or something. P.G. Wodehouse. Is this familiar?
Jeeves? Right,
yes.
right page.
Yes.
Yeah, I've not read his books, but yeah, I've heard of him.
They are, I mean, as I say, it might be a very English sense of humor, but if I want a laugh, it is absolutely guaranteed. And it's, as I say, it's, very, very old now, but it just never is anything less than fresh.
I think
So
you can
I
still
do.
find
I
him
go
in
back to
the.
that.
I think you can still find him in bookstores now. He's a
Yes,
classic. Yeah.
absolutely. Oh yes, never go out of print, I don't think. And also, slightly for the same reason, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Does that mean anything to anyone? That
Yes.
too is
Yes.
very, very funny. So there too that I'd go back to. And otherwise, I have authors I keep going back and back to. But usually reading new books, not the same book. I'm not a good rereader, actually. I always feel there's just too much to get through to reread books, which is probably not a good idea, because I think you get something new out of books when you read them second and third time. But yeah, it's the humor that I usually go back to. I need a little boost.
Thank you, Rita, for these recommendations. So again, it was the author P.G. Wodehouse and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Thank you so much.